We will now move to the first session of today, which is focused on measurement. And for this, I would like to ask our moderator to come to the stage. So Mrs. Nasrin Sultana is Deputy Secretary in the Trade Support Measures Wing of the Bangladesh Ministry of Commerce. And she's responsible for preparing Bangladesh to a sustainable transition from its status as a least developed country. And she actively implements several strategic plans, including the Doha Program of Action, the Smooth Transition Strategy, and the 9 5-year plan related to the Bangladesh Commerce Ministry. So thank you for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Hello, good morning to all. I will be your moderator for the session 1. Firstly, in the dais, I call our respected speakers of the presentation, Mr. Hyung-Seung Ha, Mr. Stephen Altman, Mr. Thang Nguyen Kwok, and Mr. Massimiliano Tani. On the stage, please. As many of us know that globalization is multidimensional, it is influenced by numerous channels that are connecting economies together, from trade and investment flows to the movement of people and to the rise of technology and trade digitalization. Policymakers and experts have thus worked on frameworks that measure the degree of today's globalized world. For session 1, our set of esteemed speakers will talk about measurement dimensions, methodologies, and approaches employed in building the framework, while also discussing emerging trends in globalization. This session seeks to describe recent globalization trends and factors explaining how it has evolved in recent years. For this session, we have 4 presentations, as Mr. Hyung-Seung Ha will introduce ADB's Global Integration Index, or GII, which has just been published last December 2023. Mr. Ha is a professor of economics at Onsei University, Republic of Korea. His main research interests include macroeconomics, international economics, and applied econometrics. Professor Ha is the president-elect of the Korea International Economic Association. Mr. Stephen Altman will present the DHL Global Connectedness Index and its recent findings based on the latest report published in March this year. Mr. Altman is a senior research scholar at the New York University Stern School of Business and an adjunct assistant professor in New York University Stern's Department of Management and Organizations. He is also director of the DHL Initiative on Globalization at New York University Stern's Center for the Future of Management. Mr. Thang Nguyen Kwok will share insights from his paper on supply chain linkages in Asia and how they have shifted in recent times. Mr. Nung leads Oxford Economics Asia's macro consulting team in Singapore, where he supports clients with carrying out bespoke forecast and scenario modeling. His core expertise is in policy analysis related to international trade and investment. Our last speaker is Mr. Massimiliano Tani, who will talk about his paper on regional integration and its impact on productivity and innovation. Mr. Tani is an applied economist working at the University of New South Wales in Australia. He is also a research fellow at the Institute of Labor Economics and Global Labor Organization in Germany. His research focuses on topics related to human capital, including its influence on productivity and economic development, labor markets, and the socio-economic integration of migrants. To kickstart the session, I would like to invite Professor Ha to come to the podium for his presentation.
Okay, I'm very happy to present the project that ADB team and I have been working together over the past years. Given I have only 15 minutes for presentation, let me get straight to the main story of the project. The aim of the project is straightforward. The first, develop composite indexes for global and regional integration. Second, empirically evaluate their effect on economic growth and income inequality and inclusive growth. Third, suggest some policy implications. Let me start with some short introduction of why it is important to consider global and regional integration together. As we all know, globalization is one of the most noticeable phenomena over the past decade. It has been proposed as a key strategy for economic growth and human development. However, globalization can create new threats at the same time. The main concern is that fierce competition may contribute to income inequalities, potentially undermining economic and social cohesion. Some argue that globalization has been a major driving force in widening inequality between and within countries. Meanwhile, regional integration has gained momentum in response to intensifying global competition and deepening polarization. For example, regional trading arrangements such as FTA and RTA have increased substantially with rapid globalization. As for RTA in the Asia-Pacific region, you can recall RCEP, CPTPP, and IPEF, which can provide a platform for economic cooperation. Regional integration is often thought to provide business opportunities on a smaller regional scale with less exposure to intensifying global competition and financial risk of full liberalization. So, along with this development, growing attention has arisen as to how the expansion of regional integration can be related to the context of globalization. For example, open regionalism argues that regionalization can be regarded as a stepping stone to globalization. So countries can test their product in regional market and promote the liberalization process and eventually increase the probability of moving their product into global market. In particular, some developing countries may wish to promote regionalization as a way to build a more controlled path toward globalization. Against this backdrop, this project examines how global and regional integration differ in cost and benefit. So first, we developed global and regional integration composite indexes. Using the same platform, we are able to examine how relatively well each country has progressed in global and regional integration. Then we examine how global and regional integration could affect economic growth, income inequality, and inclusive growth. If global and regional integration suggests different implications, they can be useful information for managing integration policies in different layers of geographic groupings. Let me briefly talk about the structure of our global and regional integration indexes. The Global Integration Index built upon HO and PA, which are published in 2018 and 2021, but it is updated and extended substantially to better capture the increasingly complex nature of globalization. For example, two new dimensions are added. One is the technology and digital connectivity, and the other one is the environment to reflect their growing roles in globalization. Various new indicators are also added to the existing dimensions. As a result, the rule system has 43 indicators, and they are assigned across 8 dimensions, depending on their origin and relevancy. The database has 173 countries across 6 regions from 2006 to 2018. As I mentioned, the Regional Integration Index is constructed using the same dimensions and indicators, ensuring compatibility with the Global Integration Index. The obvious exception is that indicators are defined in terms of regional values whenever applicable. Okay, this is the overall structure of the Global and Regional Integration Indexes. There are 8 dimensions, and each dimension has 5 to 6 indicators. Due to time, I'm not going to go through individual indicators, but for details, please see a ADB publication titled Measuring Globalization Framework Analysis implications published last year. Okay, let me skim through a few procedures used to make a composite indexes. The indicators can have a different unit of measurement, so normalization is required to bring them to the same standard. We normalize the indicators using panel min-max rescaling in the range of 0 to 1. Once normalized, the indicators are weighted and aggregated to make a composite indexes. There are two steps involved. First, the indicators in each dimension weight average to make a dimensional index. And in second stage, the derived dimensional index is weight average to make overall index of global and regional integration. In each step, the weights are empirically determined by principal component analysis, PCA. PCA can group indicators to form a composite index that can capture as many common movements as possible. Okay, I now present the Global and Regional Integration Index. The result presented is from the underlying paper written 2 years ago. In that paper, the sample period ends in 2018, so just before the COVID-19 pandemic. Recently, ADB team updated the index to add 3 years up to 2021. However, it is still under study how those extended indexes could affect economic growth, income inequality, and inclusive growth. I think this part of examining economic consequences is crucial to understand the feature and characteristics of the indexes. So I'll frame my presentation on the result in the underlying paper, which include an empirical analysis concerning the effect of global and regional integration on economic growth, income inequality, and inclusive growth. Okay, here are each country's, this table shows each country's global integration index. Due to space constraint, only the top 25 countries are reported for 3 years, 2006, 2012, and 2018. Across the 3 years, the Netherlands has been most integrated globally. And the other top 10 are also EU countries, possibly except for Singapore. Okay, the black line shows the Global Integration Index average over all countries. There is an uptrend suggesting that global integration has risen over the period of 2006 to 2018. The left panel shows how the Global Integration Index differs by income level. The message is very clear. The high income group is the most globally integrated, with the effect being dominant over all the other income groups. The upper middle and lower middle income groups follows. The low income group is the least globally integrated. The right panel shows how the Global Integration Index differs by region. The EU ranks highest in global integration, and North America ranks second highest. Asia and the Pacific rank third in most of the years. The Middle East and Latin America closely follows. Africa is the least globally integrated. Okay, this shows 8-dimensional indexes of global integration by income, which I'm gonna skip because of time. But there is one observation particularly interesting. Global integration seems to stagnate or become even weaker in the first 3 dimensions, namely trade and investment, money and finance, global value chain. Those 3 are like a traditional transmission channels of globalization, and they are often highlighted in the press as evidence of slowing globalization. However, our analysis shows that global integration has strength in all the other 5 dimensions. The effects are particularly pronounced in the new dimension of technology and digital connectivity. Indeed, this dimension has created new area for global linkages. So physical borders no longer limit interactions across countries. Okay, this shows 8-dimensional indexes of global integration by region. The EU and North America rank first or second across dimensions. The Middle East, Latin America, and Asia, the Pacific compete for the third place, while the Africa is the least globally integrated in most of the dimensions. Okay, this shows each country's regional integration index. Netherlands is most integrated with other EU members for 2006 and 2018, and Belgium for 2012. Okay, this shows regional integration index by region. Obviously, the EU tops the list, followed by North America. Asia, the Pacific ranks the third, but the Middle East performs equally well, possibly reflecting cooperation and coordination by countries in the GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council, for deepening regional integration. Latin America follows, and again, the Africa is the least regionally integrated. Okay, this shows 8-dimensional index of regional integration, and no doubt the EU is the most regionally integrated, ranking first or second across dimensions, and the North America follows. Okay, based on the constructed indexes, we now empirically examine how these indexes affect economic growth, income inequality, and inclusive growth. For this, panel regression is estimated with country fixed effect. Each regression has the global or regional integration index as an explanatory variable. Additional explanatory variables are introduced to improve the fitness. The dependent variables are annual growth rate of GDP per capita for economic growth, Gini index by the World Inequality Database for income inequality, and the growth rate adjusted for income inequality for inclusive growth. As for the inclusive growth has stood for a wide spectrum of equitable growth, but we are focused on equitable income growth. As a matter of equitable income growth, the growth rate is adjusted for using, the growth rate is adjusted using the Atkinson's equality index of the income distribution. Okay, this table shows the result for the effect of global integration by income level, which I'm gonna skip because of time. Yeah, I'm gonna skip. I think I got only 1 minute now, 30 seconds, so I'm gonna skip all, and I'll show this, which might be more interesting. And this shows the result for the effect of integration on economic growth by region. And if you look at the left panel, regional integration increases economic growth in all regions, and effect are also all statistically significant, possibly except for Africa, which is significant only at the 14% level. The result seems to be more favorable than those of global integration. In the right panel, global integration also increases economic growth, but the effects are significant only in the 3 regions: Asia and the Pacific, the EU, and Latin America. Okay, this is effect of integration on income inequality, and regional integration worsens income inequality, but the effects are not statistically significant except for the Middle East. If you look at the right panel, global integration also worsens income inequality, but this time effect is statistically significant in the Asia and the Pacific region. But finally, the result for the effect of integration on inclusive growth. Regional integration foster inclusive growth in the three regions. Sorry, the Middle East is not included because due to the lack of usable data point. And regional integration fosters inclusive growth in the three regions, and the effects are all statistically significant. Again, the result seems to be more favorable than those of global integration. Global integration also fosters inclusive growth, but the effects are significant only in the two regions. So let me finish on my presentation with some comment. We show both global and regional integration has strengths from 2006 to 2018, and they are moving closely together with similar patterns. By region, the EU ranks highest, and North America is the second highest. The Asia Pacific ranks third, followed by the Middle East and Latin America. Africa is the least integrated region. We also evaluate their effect on economic growth, income inequality, and inclusive growth. Global and regional integration produces similar implications, but the effect of regional integration appears to be relatively more favorable. So this may provide some scope for countries that seek to balance the pace between globalization and regional integration. In addition, regional integration may be exploited as a stepping stone to globalization. According to open regionalism, regionalization is a good preparation for opening an economy and provide a safer version of globalization. So openness argues that open regionalism is a device to speed up progress toward global liberalization. So the remaining issue is how regional cooperation and initiatives evolve further while maintaining a commitment to multilateralism so that regional and global liberalization proceed together and reinforce each other. That's about all I have to say. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Ha. Now is the turn for Mr. Stephen Altman. He will present the DHL Global Connectedness Index and its recent findings based on the latest report published in March this year.
Thanks very much. This microphone is okay, yeah? Okay, can we have the presentation? Great, well, thank you very much. It's really an honor to be a part of this session. So I'll first just very briefly introduce our DHL Global Connectedness Index, share some of the results from the 2024 edition, and then I'll offer some brief thoughts on policy implications. My colleagues and I have been developing this index since 2011, and we released the latest edition just this past March. What we do in this index is we analyze the development of globalization based on the development of a variety of aspects of trade, capital, information, and people flows, and we analyze them both at the level of the world as a whole, which is the focus of my talk today, as well as for individual countries and territories around the world. And one of the unique features of the index is that we strive to the maximum extent possible to analyze both the size and the geographic patterns of international activity in a parallel way. The size or depth dimension of the index, like other globalization indexes, looks at the intensity of international flows relative to domestic activity. The breadth dimension of the index then looks at the extent to which countries' international activity is spread out globally around the world or more narrowly focused. And recently we've complemented our core breadth measure with a variety of other indicators shown on the screen to try to get at related research questions. The key message from our 2024 report, somewhat controversially, was that deglobalization is still a risk rather than a current reality. And we reached that conclusion by examining the evidence for and against three widely discussed possibilities for how deglobalization could potentially unfold. And here I'm using the term in a broad way, although I quite appreciate the more narrow definition used in the IMF work. But here for general discourse, three scenarios: the possibility of a shift from international to domestic activity, the possibility of a fracturing or fragmentation along geopolitical lines, and the possibility of a turn from globalization to regionalization. And since these are discussed so widely, what I'd like to do over the next few minutes is to take us on a quick journey from some of the evidence supporting each of these claims of deglobalization to a sampling of the evidence that led us to the conclusion that none of these are really yet major developments globally, and so deglobalization is still a risk rather than a current reality. First, on the possibility of a turn from international to domestic activity, that's what the depth dimension of our index measures by looking at international versus domestic activity in various areas. If these depth trends go down, that means we really are seeing a turn from international to domestic activity. At the extreme, a level of 0% would mean that no flows cross national borders at all. On the other hand, if these trends go up, that means more of the world's activity is crossing national borders. At the extreme, we define 100% to mean that borders and distance have ceased to matter, and we're in a frictionless world where interactions are just as likely to happen across borders as they are within them. Here's the trade part of the index up through the year 2020. The fact that the value of world trade here in value-added terms relative to global output declined after the 2008 global financial crisis started a lot of the speculation about globalization going into reverse. But strong trade growth over the last couple of years brought that part of the index back up to a record high level in 2022, and it remained close to that record high in 2023. We also have a recent rising trend on the capital part of the index. One of the factors there has been an increase in the value of announced greenfield FDI to the highest level relative to world GDP in more than a decade over the past couple of years. And that's actually just one of several indicators that point us to the view that companies have really not lost their appetite for participation in international opportunities. The globalization of information flows is higher than the globalization of trade and capital flows, but we haven't actually seen further globalization on that dimension since 2021. People flows are much less globalized than trade and capital flows and information flows, and they were hit hardest by the COVID pandemic, but they're coming back strongly. So none of our four categories actually show a shift from international to domestic activity, and so when we put them all together, we actually see international activity at a record high level relative to domestic activity. Now, that high level, though, is still only 25% on that scale I mentioned before, running from 0%, no international flows, to 100% a frictionless world. So we're still actually closer to a world of completely separate countries than we are to a fully globalized or completely integrated world. But to start to build up a summary on the possibility of a shift from globalization to a shift from international to domestic activity, that's clearly not the pattern that we see in the data. The growth of most kinds of international activity has been keeping pace with or even exceeding the growth of domestic activity. What about the possibility of a fracturing or fragmentation of the world economy along geopolitical lines? We analyzed that in various ways in our report. Here I'll focus on the possibility of a split between rival blocs of countries using a classification of countries into close allies that was developed by Capital Economics. But the results are actually robust to the use of other kinds of blocs as well. The general picture that we see is that countries at the center of current tensions do have major geopolitically driven shifts in their flow patterns, but the rest of the world does not yet seem to be showing the same kinds of geopolitically driven shifts. Yes, direct ties between the US and China have diminished. On average, the share of US flows that are to or from China and the share of China's flows that are to or from the US have both fallen by about 1/4 since 2016, and those declines are widespread across almost all the types of trade, capital, information, and people flows that we analyze. That said, though, I've actually pulled back from using the term decoupling in the case of the US and China because those two countries are still connected by larger flows than almost every other pair of countries worldwide, and they actually had an unusually high level of connectedness before the recent declining trends began. In contrast, I think the example that really does merit the term decoupling is the profound cut to Russia's ties with Europe and other Western-aligned economies since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That caused Russia to experience the largest decline in global connectedness that we've ever recorded for a major economy in our study. But as I said, we don't find similar results for the rest of the world. To start to show you that, first with respect to trade, let's look simply at the ratio of the value of trade happening between geopolitical blocs to the value of trade within blocs. If that goes down, that's evidence of fragmentation, because a smaller part of the world's trade is crossing between the blocs. Indeed, the share of trade happening between geopolitical blocs has declined since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That's absolutely true. But part of that reflected the reversal of the opposite pattern during the COVID pandemic, and a big part of it reflected the major reorientation of Russia's trade flows that we've seen since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. If we exclude Russia from the analysis, the share of trade happening between versus within blocs has so far just declined to roughly where it was before the start of the COVID pandemic. And if we also exclude direct trade between the US and China, the share of trade happening between blocs has just returned to where it was before the start of the US-China trade war. In preparation for today's talk, I did a quick parallel of that analysis using announced greenfield FDI. And what we see is that the ratio of announced greenfield FDI projects between versus within blocs has been on a long-term declining trend that started well before the current escalation of tensions, and that after that we actually see a small rebound since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I actually don't think the rebound is probably very significant, but I think it's quite noteworthy that this declining trend has not continued, much less have we seen an acceleration in the decline of announced greenfield FDI between versus within blocs. Finally, as a last piece of evidence against the sense that there's a global pattern of geoeconomic fragmentation that's yet really affecting patterns of international activity, here's the average geopolitical distance measured based on UN General Assembly voting patterns for a variety of kinds of flows, excluding Russia and direct flows between the US and China from the calculations. What we see on that basis is that we actually don't find declines in the average geopolitical distance traversed by those flows. So that leads us to the view that as yet, yes, countries at the center of present tensions do have major geopolitically driven shifts in their flow patterns, but for the rest of the world, we don't yet have strong evidence that there are major shifts that we're seeing. Finally, on the possibility of a turn from globalization to regionalization, what started many people believing that that was happening was a graph like this one, which received a lot of attention in a publication by McKinsey and in The Economist as trade tensions were escalating a few years ago. It shows an increase in the share of trade happening within 7 major geographic regions starting in 2012. But what got less attention was the fact that that rising trend for intra-regional trade actually ended in 2016, and it wasn't even robust to alternative ways of dividing the world up into regions. If we look at the share of trade happening within 3 larger regions, there's no rising trend. If we look at the share of trade happening just in simple continents, it hasn't increased. And if we look at the share of trade happening within 22 smaller regions, it's a declining trend. The fact that we get such different results depending on how many regions we use and where we draw the region boundaries leads us to prefer to measure regionalization by simply looking at the average distance in kilometers traversed by countries' international flows. And what we see so far is that international trade has tended to take place over longer distances, the opposite of what you would expect if it was becoming more regional. Similarly, for capital and information flows, we tend to see stable or longer average distances. People flows did happen over shorter distances during the COVID pandemic. We don't yet have post-COVID data on people flows, but I expect the average distance will go up once those data come in. So on the question of a turn from globalization to regionalization, we don't see it yet in the data. I wouldn't be surprised if we see some increases in regionalization going forward, given the efforts that many companies and governments are putting there and how long it takes to reorient supply chains. That said, though, the fact that there's already a high level of regionalization in international activity, about 3 times more than you would expect in a frictionless world, I think actually limits the extent to that we might see large increases in regionalization. To put all the summary points together then, we came to the conclusion, as I mentioned, that deglobalization is still a risk rather than a current reality. And I'd like to conclude my presentation by trying to relate that a bit to the discourse on deglobalization and to the policy implications. As I said at the beginning, our report looks only at actual patterns of international activity. I think actually what drives a lot of this discourse on deglobalization is a set of different developments that, to be a little bit pretty about it, in a forthcoming article, I label them all starting with the letter P. I think what's really driving a lot of the discourse on deglobalization is shifts in preferences about levels of globalization, changes in policies supporting or constraining globalization, as well as increases in policy uncertainty, plans that companies are discussing regarding reshoring, nearshoring, and so on, and predictions about future changes in policies and patterns of international flows. The 4 columns on the right, I think, really do substantiate an elevated risk of deglobalization, which I would contrast with the lack of actual deglobalization that's taken place so far. What are the implications for policy and for policy research? I'll just offer very briefly 4 thoughts. First, I think it's important to balance the very important warnings about the costs of deglobalization with reassurance, as long as the data supports it, about the resilience of international flows. We don't want to contribute to making deglobalization a self-fulfilling prophecy. Why do I say that? If decision makers become convinced that the world is deglobalizing and there's nothing that they can do about it, a race to boost national self-sufficiency would be a natural response. In contrast, the resilience of international flows highlights the fact that countries still have strong incentives to work together to preserve the benefits that they derive from globalization. Second, de-risking policies, to the extent that they need to be implemented, should take into account the resilience of international flows. On the one hand, that actually reduces the scope within which de-risking is required. On the other hand, it makes it much harder to directly reduce reliance on a particular partner country. I think the shift from direct to partial shift from direct to indirect trade from China to the US presents a real cautionary example, because indirect trade, presumably with reduced visibility, can be more risky. Third, we still need to address the societal causes of the root causes of societal concerns about globalization, since if deglobalization hasn't really happened, deglobalization is not addressing any of these underlying concerns. And fourth, don't get distracted by debates about global trends. For me, it's a very interesting question academically whether the world is becoming more or less globalized. I think for national policy making, that's generally the wrong question. As we show in our report, most countries, if you flip through the profiles in the back, most countries are intensively connected to only a small number of partner countries. For national policy making, I think what really matters most is whether there are changes in approaches to globalization specifically in your country's key partners, not whether the world as a whole is becoming more or less globalized. With that, I'll wrap up. We have some copies of the reports here. They're also available free online, as well as some data visualization and analysis tools. And if you'd like to delve into the country-level detail, the trends on all the individual measures, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to share a more substantial research data set. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Stephen Altman. Now is the turn for Mr. Theng Nguyen Quoc. He will present insights from his paper on supply chain linkages in Asia and how they have shifted in recent times.
Thank you very much. It's an honor for me to be here. For my little talk today, I'm going to first introduce you a bit around the context, then present some of the stylized facts from the findings, and then from the perspective of the private sector, seeing that I'm the black sheep here. I'm coming from Oxford Economics, which is a private macroeconomic consulting firms. In the room of many policymakers, academia, I'll try to present a bit the perspective of the private sector, and especially looking into the opportunities, seeing where things can improve as well. So first, a little bit about the black sheep, Oxford Economics. We are now the largest group of macroeconomists in the private sector, with more than 400 economists globally across 20 offices. Our bread and butter is very much macroeconomic forecasting, with forecasts on national, industry, cities level. We are very proud to count clients like the Asian Development Bank, but also the World Bank for the global economic prospects with our scenarios in there. We have worked with many other governments in the region, including Bappenas in Indonesia, as well as many central banks like the Hong Kong MA and Singapore monetary authorities. In this particular case, we are working with Heinrich Foundation, which is a private philanthropy very focused on the topic of international trade, to present with you a very short, simple outlook of where we see some of the trends in terms of global supply chains, especially in the context of Asia. With very esteemed speakers here, I feel like this is basically a very simple lemon ice cream in between the very complex causes of meat and fish in between. But funnily, we arrive at many of the same conclusions as well. So in this particular studies, we were really focusing on the flows of intermediate goods across countries. And we find that first, for all the talks of nearshoring, reshoring, onshoring, global supply chains have been, in fact, expanding. We see that the total trade in intermediate goods have grew about 6% annually between 2018 and 2022. A little outdated. We're actually working with clients to update this and also adding other dimensions to it. At the global level, we don't quite see regional sourcings happening yet. We do see some isolated incidences happening. But across the major world regions, we see that Asia is where most of the dynamism is. We see that China's supply chain is becoming less important for the US and Japan, but it actually has become more important for several G7 countries like Germany or the UK, which really brings to the questions around friendshoring and how you would define the new geopolitical blocks. We also see that multiple hotspots are emerging. And here there are certain countries like Indonesia and Vietnam, whose supply chain have been expanding at double-digit growth for the last 5 years. And as we look into a few hotspots countries, 7 to be exact, now what we find that they just very different from each other. And that would bring to a point that there is not quite a single winning formula for countries as they navigate the reconfiguration of global supply chain. And strategies can vary in terms of economic and geopolitical as well. Very quickly on what we're talking about, here we just very simple, using trade data, filter it in for intermediate goods, and to filter out the fuel, which is more volatile. So here we looking at the flows of things from crops used in food production to textiles, metals, and computer chips needed to manufacture goods. And why we look at this? Because typically it is a better indication of supply chains and less likely for trade diversion compared to, say, trade in final goods. So the first finding, we see that as we look at the evolution of global trade in intermediate goods, it actually have dipped a little bit in 2019, have another difficult year in 2020, but by 2022, total trade has actually picked up about 25% higher than the level we see in 2018. Good news all around. When we look at nearshoring, what we see is that at the global level, we do not quite see it yet. Because if you flip it around, what would be nearshoring would indicate is country relocating their production closer to home. And in that case, we would see that countries are more likely to source their inputs from other countries within their same regions. Here, crudely looking at the share of each region, what's the sourcing, where they're getting it from within the region. And we see that globally, it actually has mostly dropped in most countries, most regions. Asia is the only region globally where we see that it has become slightly more likely to source its inputs from within the region, but the change is not marginally, it's very marginal that we don't quite see a trend in there. Now, of course, as we look deeper into each particular flows like Mexico, US, that's where we see some of the changes there. But then you would ask, okay, it's not nearshoring, it's not the region. How about friendshoring? Let's group it with the story of China decoupling for example. And here is another simple graph showing you the importance of China inputs in the import basket across countries. And we see that, yes, China is decoupling from the supply chain of the US and Japan. So China's share of intermediate goods imports in the US has dropped from 18.5% in 2018 to 14% in 2022. Interestingly, the largest drop occurred in 2018-2019 during the tariff escalation. So I think there's quite a bit still in the trade wars that have some scarring effect here. We also see decoupling happening between China and Japan. But outside of that, we see for some other G7 countries, like Germany, like UK, then China's share of intermediate goods imports have actually increased. And here, again, it begs the question, who's your real friend? And as we see, as an economist trying to pretend to know anything about politics, alliance shift a lot over the course of history. And also, it feels like we've been looking everything from this lens of geopoliticals, but there's also other drivers coming at play. So say the case of the UK, for example, that's very much driven by Brexit. So there's also dynamics within each country that also merit attention. And the next message is where the opportunities in Asia. And here we do a simple exercise of looking at the growth of intermediate goods export by each Asian countries for the last 5 years. And what we see is that Vietnam and Indonesia led the chart. They grew up about 13% and 10% annually within the last 5 years, extremely rapid growth. We also see other countries like Taiwan, Australia, India, Malaysia, Papua New Guinea, that have higher than average growth rate when it comes to IG exports. And generally across the board, we see most Asian countries doing quite well. So that begs the questions that maybe it's not just the China plus one story we've been hearing about, but also China plus 2, 3, 4, because first, China's production is just so huge that no single country can absorb all of that. Secondly, revisiting the story of China plus one, which have been hearing about since 2010, when rural wages in China started to rise to the point that many firms have already started to think about relocating. It only took the double punches of the trade war and COVID-19 with the rise of supply chain resilience that led to a serious considering of supply chains across at the private sector level. So there is also the economics here matter quite a bit as well. And it's more than just geopolitical. And if we were to look into these 7 countries, so starting from Papua New Guinea, all the way to Vietnam to the left, and we look into what the economies is like, I guess the most remarkable thing is they're nothing like each other. We have Vietnam and India, which are offering very competitive FDI, competitive labor structure. We have countries like Taiwan and Australia with very advanced manufacturing. We have countries like Papua New Guinea, which basically have been growing quite a lot with the export of nickel that is being used for the batteries production. We have countries that are a bit in between, with Indonesia having a lot of natural resources, nickel, but also very competitive FDI schemed. Australia is also in between some of that. So economic-wise, they are a very heterogeneous bunch. And when it comes to geopolitics, they're also quite different as well. 3 observations. First, Vietnam and Taiwan, they actually have become more important for the supply chain of China and the US. Taiwan, very much driven by the rise of semiconductors in the last few years. Well, Vietnam, there's a whole lot of stories. And there is also a China stories in Vietnam, in the story of Vietnam, which we have heard a lot about. Because, well, see, now, since the publication of this report, we have been doing a lot of roadshows with different private sector engaged and being based in Vietnam. I can see clearly that there's many instances of Chinese company moving to Vietnam, not just for tariff jumping, but also to take advantage of the local domestic market that is growing quickly and getting much bigger. If you look into a lot of this investment, it's related to renewable energy, for example, or in a lot of other three new sectors of China. So that's more than just geopolitical stories. It's also on the supply side with many of Chinese firms now have been growing their sophistication in their ability to manage multinational networks, and the rather poor performance of Chinese domestic demand also led to a rise of many firms trying to replicate the same model using the financing in China to invest in Vietnam as well. And to a certain extent, we see as the second group with Australia, Indonesia, Malaysia. They share quite a bit there as well. Both of them have come in, have become more important for both the US and China. And a lot of these stories are at play. While India, the other hotspot countries we see here, then it has become more important for the US, but slightly less so for China. So for all the talks about China, about India being the mediator between East and West, that begs some questions as well. So that is the end of this little presentation. Just a couple of recaps. So we see globalizations have been in fact expanding, is changing, and where dynamism is in Asia. We see decoupling occurring, and we see some hotspots emerging. Now, in terms of what's next and what to watch, then yes, first, geopolitics. Not going to convince you on this. But I think you also have other factors coming at play as well, right? Industrial policies, as Pesia was mentioning earlier. But I will also highlight environmental policies, which is also becoming more important. We have CBAM that is coming into effect this year and will be ever more stringent in the next few years. That will have a big impact. We also have the EU deforestation regulations that really spark the concern of several countries like Malaysia and Indonesia. Those can have tremendous impacts on global supply chains, especially in this part of the world. And lastly, it's almost funny to come to a room full of very esteemed economists and reminds everyone that economics matter as well. And now because for global supply chains and why is it so resilient, a lot of time is because there's agglomerations economy taking place. Firms benefit from the presence of other firms, suppliers, consumers, talents, infrastructures. And right now, as it almost feels like we're in the Big Bang period where everyone is going scramble to reconfigure their own supply chains, the place that managed to capture critical mass of new actors will continue to go far. And what place that is also a fluid concept, because a place can be an industrial cluster, it could be a region, it could be a country, which have often been our focus of analysis, but it could also be a region as well. That could be looking at the regional production network as we've been trying to discuss. So with that in mind, I just close it here and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kwok. Now I would request Mr. Massimiliano Tani to come over the dais to present on his paper on regional integration and its impact on productivity and innovation.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Rolando, for being here. Thanks, ADB, and thanks to all of you for being here. I'm not sure if the slides are up. To do this. Okay, so what I want to do this morning is to present the work that I'm doing together with the ADB here, using the indicators that Professor Yu actually did, and share with you what we are learning so far. The work is together with Rolando and Lovely, who has been helping on this. The starting point is to look at regionalism as a choice. as a choice made conscientiously by policymakers. And so the question that we had in mind, I'm an applied economist, I was born as a macroeconomist and then transited into microeconomics, is to how do we identify the effects of regionalism on two outcomes that are fairly important for economic growth: labor productivity and innovation, or propensity to innovate. And we have some questions associated with that. So apologies for the maths, but sometimes it helps to identify what we're looking at and where we're looking at things. So we're taking a typical production function approach, where it says, well, the output is a function of some capital, some labor, and some activities which are in K up here, activities that are deliberately leading to produce new products, new processes, new ways of producing things more effectively. For example, investment in research and development and related activities. There is then an element which is unknown, which is all that ugly stuff over the E that says, well, we don't really know what's happening, but some of these elements are indirect consequences of regional decisions. So the question is, well, where does regionalism decisions to become friendlier or less friendly with another country comes in? And there are two entry points that we analyze. The first is a direct entry point. So there are certain activities that go into my K. Sorry, I'm not particularly good, even though I'm an academic, I'm not very good at using these sort of things. Let's see if I can make it. Oops. So there are direct decisions that are made by policymakers that help the production of new ideas and new processes. And then there are indirect effects of regionalization. It may become easier to transit, to move between places, to facilitate the flow of ideas. Why am I doing this? Because it is then straightforward to empirically go and estimate this relationship between labor productivity or probability to innovate and the determinants of that. Within this theoretical model, then, there is something else that we can do. We can nest the decision that individual firms can make in terms of their own activity. So they have certain unit costs, they produce an outcome, and how can we consider regional decisions then? Well, we consider them as a shock that can increase the amount of resources available to firms. And when firms have more resources, what can they do? Well, they can either respond by increasing their production, or by changing the way in which they produce, or by changing prices. So once again, this very simple approach from a theoretical point of view leads to a very straightforward empirical estimation where we can estimate the probability to innovate with a set of explanatory factors that include those regional decisions. And that's the key of showing you this formula. Where do we get our data? Well, we get information from the ILO for labor productivity. We use the World Bank Enterprise Survey for data on firms' innovation activities, so they have more than 100,000 firms, and it's a cross-section. And then we use the regional indicator database that are produced here by the ADB. We have two samples. We have a panel of countries, which matches our labor productivity data. We have a cross-section analysis for firms looking at innovation activity. From here, there are three messages I want to pass on to you. The first one is that regional integration matters. So even when you control for everything that you can control for in a panel analysis of labor productivity, those indicators do matter. They also do matter when you look at cross-sectional data on the probability to innovate. Once again, once you control for everything that you can, and you do all possible tests, those indicators, the professor you developed, do matter for innovation activity. Then you may ask, well, some indicators come up with a negative sign. Why is that? Well, the area we started to look at is, of course, if you have a new trade agreement today, it's unlikely that tomorrow morning you will see an explosion in trading activity. It takes time. So we've been starting looking at leads and lags of these indicators and their effects on either productivity of labor or economic activity, finding what? Well, that they actually have the expected significance and sign. So trade, which naturally at time zero, so at the same time as I measure labor productivity, comes with a negative sign, if it is lagged, the effect becomes almost magically positive and statistically significant. This is important because it can give us some indication of the timing through which the conscious decision of policymaking starts having an effect detected by data on productivity or innovation. So that's the first thing, the first message that we take away. So regional policy decisions do matter, and they come with a lag that we need to still explore and take into account. The second thing is that those indicators of regional integration are measured with reference to a geography, Central Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, etc., or and economic grouping, Asian, CAREC, and so forth. And very often, analyses tend to be based only on spatial decisions, Asia, Europe, the US, Latin America. So what we try to do, thanks to having those indicators, not only measuring the convergence inside a geographic region, but also inside economic grouping, we try to say, well, what happens when we actually use the world not as Asia, Europe, Latin America, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, but we use it as ASEAN, CAREC, and other agreements that are in place? Well, what we see is that those economically defined spaces do matter far more. So there is a much better prediction, a much better fit, a much better understanding of the results of the 8 indicators that have been developed. Then the second comment is that whenever we look at analysis of regionalism, of globalization, let's not just carry out an analysis based on geographically defined space, but also economically defined spaces. Because that's where you probably see difference. Certainly that's where we start seeing more difference than in just purely geographical terms. The final point and observation, remember in my initial equation, I was showing you that there are deliberate activities to generate and improve knowledge. It is absolutely true that a lot of knowledge comes through the form of products, comes through the form of investments. But if you look at innovation, at the innovation literature, what you will learn is that a lot of innovation and ideas come through exchanges and interactions that are embodied in people. So what happens is that, take an event like today, we do exchange information, we do learn from each other. In what product do we see the result of this interaction? In what investment do we see the result of these interactions? We don't. But we all go home with something extra that we carry with us. And this is something that I've been doing for the past 20 years, looking and measuring at these effects, which do exist in almost any field you want to look at. the expansion of higher education in China and the productivity of Chinese researchers and their increase in publications, absolutely see that. We interview lots of people at the airport asking what are they doing, what they're going to meet people, why are they facing the cost of doing that sort of activity? Well, because there are certain things they can only do in person. They have to show why cutting tea leaves in a certain way is not sufficiently good if you just buy a particular machine. You need certain adaptation that can only be done when you interact. And once again, that interaction is not captured by trade flows, by FDI flows. Maybe later on it is, but it is the ideas embodied in people that do matter. When we look at and measure innovation by sectors, and we compare it to investment in R&D, we do find that interacting does explain or is as important as half of an investment in R&D. So even paradoxically, in a world that has become more fragmented, the fact of being able to keeping in touch, to interact, does matter quite a lot. And this is something that in our analysis, we do find, especially with Asia, and I don't know where the green thing is, but you see by air transport population, an imperfect proxy, absolutely, but it's always highly, highly, highly significant. And that was a concern, for example, after 9/11 in the US, that the US wasn't able to attract international students anymore. So people were worried about, well, will this have a big effect on the productivity or innovation in the US? Well, the answer is no. And we have access to commercial data, for example, for airlines by type, so we know, what type of expenditure it is. Well, American business people kept going away or kept going in touch with the rest of the world, even at the time. And we do have evidence that going out, visiting, and learning brings back a lot more benefit than just being visited. And so the message is, yes, we live in a world that is moving away from global is good into more fragmentation. Fragmentation is a choice, and is a choice that does matter and tends to matter positively on innovation and labor productivity. But what absolutely matters is this ability to remain in touch and to connect, because all the exchanges of embodied knowledge, the one that every person has, and then becomes a new patent, a new product, a new way of processing, gets huge benefits from interacting. And that's what I wanted to say. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Massimiliano Tani. Now is the floor for the open questions from the audiences, if you have any question. And if you just mention the scholar also to whom you were making the question, that would be much more specific. Yes, we got a hand from the corner.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentations. Actually, I think there are two groups here. One group, the first two speakers were talking about methodology, and the last two were talking about specific topics that were of great interest. I have some questions for the first two and none for the second two. The indices that have been presented are really de facto indices. They do not tell us what happened in the region or in different countries in terms of specific policy instruments. And therefore, when you look at them over a long period of time, the dips or the uppers are only speculated as to what is the reason behind them. And that's the reason why I'm saying in the GII, the Globalization Integration Index, in Annex 1.1, there is a review of the different globalization indices. And the one that is really important, as far as I can see, is the KOF index of globalization, because it distinguishes between de jure and de facto. And therefore, you can always trace that if there is going to be any change in the indices, you can attribute that either to COVID-19, which is going to be speculative, or to specific policy instruments. In the case of trade and trade globalization, one can look at mean tariff rates, one can look at indicators of import restrictions, and they therefore indicate the extent to which countries actually impose specific restrictions. And that is not evident in the GII or in the DHL index of connectedness. And therefore, when you look at the movement in the graph, you will only conclude that it's probably because of this rather than something specific related to the region or to the countries. And therefore, I would still want to see where would be the policy instruments that is associated with the trend that is being indicated. Thank you.
I think you're asking about the distinction between outcome variables and policy variables, right? Yeah, I think so. For that difficult question, I'd like to call on Ronaldo ADB, who has been collaborating the work from the beginning. Actually, he's the person who currently manages and further develop the indexes at ADB. So I think he's in a better position to address your concern, particularly with the recent development that his team has made. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Hall. Yeah, I think your point is very valid. When the COF globalization index was developed, they didn't distinguish between the de facto and the jure. So this was, I think, the latest development. It's something that we are looking at, but we are focused at the moment on, as you mentioned, actual flows of investment, capital, ideas or information or digital integration. We do have some indicators that look at, for example, membership of certain agreements or participation on regional initiatives. They don't necessarily go into the detail of looking at what instruments are part or included under those agreements. So that's definitely something we could or we should look more in the future. And that's something that we can take into account for the future development of these indexes.
Thanks very much for that comment. Yes, indeed, absolutely cannot disagree with that. Exactly as Rolando was saying, we also had the same view that initially we had actually critiqued the COF index for mixing together enablers of globalization with indicators of globalization. They then made that methodological distinction between de jure and de facto. In my view, I think our index is very specialized. We want it to be very strictly focused only on actual patterns of international activity, with the idea that the index can then be related either to the enablers of globalization or to the consequences of globalization. We want to be quite strict about that. In terms of other contrasts versus the COF index, I think our index, I would say, is quite complementary with theirs. The COF index has a longer time series than we do, so it's useful for longer run historical analysis. For global trends, the COF index simply produces a simple average across the countries, whereas we do a distinct global level of analysis versus country level. So so essentially the global trends in the COF index are influenced more by smaller countries, whereas we're producing more of a picture of aggregate global flows. We bring in the geographic dimension, and then we strive to produce a more timely series of publications. So there's a shorter lag between when our index comes versus the COF index. But I think they're they're quite complementary.
And may I add one more thing? It requires extra care when you're trying to include policy variables into the index system, because the effect of policy variable may become ineffective or utilized as the private agents are trying to get around this. So the effect of policy variable may not be fully realized. That's the one thing we are a bit careful of when you include the policy variable in the system that consists of outcome variables.
Can I follow up? Can I follow up? Actually, the dip during the pandemic in COVID-19 actually reveals two things. One is the external effect, and the other one is that some government authorities, governments actually considered that particular dip as an opportunity to actually implement specific policies, especially related to trade. And that is not captured in any of these indicators. So if that's the case, what's the point of it? Thank you.
As I work in the Ministry of Commerce in our country, one example I can give that he has mentioned right now is that 2019, when the COVID was there, in my country, the service sector, especially on the online service sector, has increased, developed much. So it has changed a lot, and it is a blessing in that sense. Our service sector has changed. Now, any more question from the audiences, please? No more question? We have time left. If you allow me, I want to have a question for Mr. Massimiliano Tani. The study provides evidence that deliberate political and economic decisions to integrate, such as forming regional economic blocks, tend to improve labor productivity and innovation. In what ways can these economic blocks address potential declines in the productivity and innovation caused by technological decoupling?
Thanks so much for the question. As I was saying, it's absolutely true that efforts to, let's call it, decouple do have consequences. But I think there is a discourse that needs to be sort of explored as well, that the technology is only to a certain extent disembodied. And so a lot of the ideas, the generation of new products, the generation of new innovation actually comes through the ability that people have to either put in place what the products and the processes that have put together, as well as the ability to keep on exchanging, comparing, and generate new ideas. And as time goes on, where there will be perhaps more restriction and become more costly to shift things between one country and the other, the fact that technology nowadays allows so much easier connectivity is not the solution, but certainly one way to reduce the negative effects of these sort of impositions that are made by decisions.
Thank you very much. Our session was from 9:50 to 11 a.m. So our time is up already. It's time for us to have a short break. So this is the end of the session. Thank you all for being on the stage and nice presentations. And thanks for the audiences to have a patience to hear it. And please have a big hand for them. Thank you.